Chapter 3 of Moonfleet. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Simon Evers. Moonfleet by J. Mead Faulkner. Chapter 3. A Discovery. Some bold adventurers disdain the limits of their little reign, and unknown regions dare descry. Still, as they run, they look behind, they hear a voice in every wind, and snatch a fearful joy. Gray. I have said that I used often in the daytime, when not at school, to go to the churchyard, because, being on a little rise, there was the best view of the sea to be had from it, and on a fine day you could watch the French privateers creeping along the cliffs under the Snout, and lying in wait for an Indiaman or up-channel trader. There were at Moonfleet few boys of my own age, and none that I cared to make my companion, so I was given to muse alone, and did so for the most part in the open air, all the more because my aunt did not like to see an idle boy with muddy boots about her house. For a few weeks, indeed, after the day that I had surprised Elzevir and Ratsey, I kept away from the church, fearing to meet them there again, but a little later resumed my visits, and saw no more of them. Now, my favourite seat in the churchyard was the flat top of a raised stone tomb, which stands on the south-east of the church. I have heard Mr. Glennie call it an altar tomb, and in its day it had been a fine monument, being carved around with festoons of fruit and flowers, but had suffered so much from the weather that I never was able to read the lettering on it, or to find out who had been buried beneath. Here I chose most to sit, not only because it had a flat and convenient top, but because it was screened from the wind by a thick clump of yew trees. These yews had once, I think, completely surrounded it, but had either died or been cut down on the south side, so that anyone sitting on the grave top was snug from the weather, and yet possessed a fine prospect over the sea. On the other three sides the yews grew close and thick, embarring the tomb like the high back of a fireside chair, and many times in autumn I have seen the stone slab crimson with the fallen waxy berries, and taken some home to my aunt, who liked to taste them with a glass of sloe gin after her Sunday dinner. Others beside me, no doubt, found this tomb a comfortable seat and look-out, for there was quite a path worn to it on the south side, though all the times I had visited it I had never seen anyone there. So it came about that on a certain afternoon in the beginning of February, in the year 1758, I was sitting on this tomb looking out to sea. Though it was so early in the air was soft and warm as a May day, and so still that I could hear the drumming of turnips that Gaffer George was flinging into a cart on the hillside near half a mile away. Ever since the floods of which I have spoken, the weather had been open, but with high winds and little or no rain. Thus, as the land dried after the floods, there began to open cracks in the heavy clay soil on which Moonfleet is built, such as are usually only seen with us in the height of summer. There were cracks by the side of the path in the sea meadows between the village and the church, and cracks in the churchyard itself, and one running right up to this very tomb. It must have been past 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and I was for returning to tea at my aunt's, when underneath the stone on which I sat I heard a rumbling and crumbling, and on jumping off saw that the crack in the ground had still further widened just where it came up to the tomb, and that the dry earth had so shrunk and settled that there was a hole in the ground a foot or more across. Now this hole reached under the big stone that formed one side of the tomb, and, falling on my hands and knees and looking down it, I perceived that there was under the monument a larger cavity into which the hole opened. I believe there never was boy yet who saw a hole in the ground, or a cave in a hill, or much more an underground passage, but longed incontinently to be into it and discover whither it led. So it was with me, and seeing that the earth had fallen enough into the hole to open a way under the stone, I slipped myself in, feet foremost, dropped down onto a heap of fallen mould, and found that I could stand upright under the monument itself. Now this was what I had expected, for I thought that there had been below this grave a vault the roof of which had given way and let the earth fall in. But as soon as my eyes were used to the dimmer light, I saw that it was no such thing, but that the hole into which I had crept was only the mouth of a passage, which sloped gently down in the direction of the church. My heart fell to thumping with eagerness and surprise, for I thought I had made a wonderful discovery, and that this hidden way would certainly lead to great things, perhaps even to Blackbeard's hoard. For ever since Mr. Glennie's tale, I had constantly before my eyes a vision of the diamond and the wealth it was to bring me. The passage was 2 paces broad, as high as a tall man, and cut through the soil, without bricks or any other lining. And what surprised me most was that it did not seem deserted nor mouldy and cobwebbed, as one who expects such a place to be, but rather a well-used thoroughfare. For I could see the soft clay floor was trodden with the prints of many boots, and marked with a trail, as if some heavy thing had been dragged over it. So I set out down the passage, reaching out my hand before me lest I should run against anything in the dark, and sliding my feet slowly to avoid pitfalls in the floor. But before I had gone 6 paces, the darkness grew so black that I was frightened, and so far from going on was glad to turn sharp about, and see the glimmer of light that came in through the hole under the tomb. Then a horror of the darkness seized me, and before I well knew what I was about, I found myself wriggling my body up under the tombstone onto the churchyard grass, and was once more in the low evening sunlight and the soft, sweet air. Home I ran to my aunt's, for it was past tea-time, and beside that I knew I must fetch a candle if I were ever to search out the passage, and to search it I had well made up my mind, no matter how much I was scared for this moment. My aunt gave me but a sorry greeting when I came into the kitchen, for I was late and hot. She never said much when displeased, but had a way of saying nothing which was much worse, and would only reply yes or no, and that after an interval, to anything that was asked of her. So the meal was silent enough, for she had finished before I had arrived, and I ate but little myself, being too much occupied with the thought of my strange discovery, and finding beside the tea lukewarm and the victuals not enticing. You may guess that I said nothing of what I had seen, but made up my mind that as soon as my aunt's back was turned, I would get a candle and tinder-box and return to the churchyard. The sun was down before Aunt Jane gave thanks for what we had received, and then, turning to me, she said in a cold and measured voice, "John, I have observed that you are often out and about of nights, sometimes as late as 7:30 or 8. Now it is not seemly for young folk to be abroad after dark, and I do not choose that my nephew should be called a gadabout. What's bred in the bone will come out in the flesh, and 'twas with such loafing that your father began his wild ways, and afterwards led my poor sister such a life as never was, till the mercy of Providence took him away." Aunt Jane often spoke thus of my father, whom I never remembered, but believed him to have been an honest man, and good fellow to boot, if something given to roaming and to contraband. "So understand," she went on, "that I will not have you out again this evening, no, nor any other evening, after dusk. Bed is the place for youth when night falls, but if this seem to you too early, you can sit with me for an hour in the parlour, and I will read you a discourse of Dr. Sherlock that will banish vain thoughts, and leave you in a fit frame for quiet sleep." So she led the way into the parlour, took the book from the shelf, put it on the table within the little circle of light cast by a shaded candle, and began. It was dull enough, though I had borne such tribulations before, and the drone of my aunt's voice would have sent me to sleep, as it had done at other times, even in a straight-backed chair, had I not been so full of my discovery and chafed at this delay. Thus, all the time my aunt read of spiritualities and saving grace, I had my mind on diamonds and all kinds of mammon, for I never doubted that Blackbeard's treasure would be found at the end of that secret passage. The sermon finished at last, and my aunt closed the book with a stiff "good night" for me. I was for giving her my formal kiss, but she made as if she did not see me, and turned away. So we went upstairs, each to our own room, and I never kissed Aunt Jane again. There was a